Thank you for that introduction, Rachel, and for the invitation to speak. Yeah, I was at UB for about 7 years almost, so it's really nice to be back again. So I'm going to talk about some research focused on understanding emotion regulation today. And emotion regulation is really important clinically because we know that it's a key predictor of quite a few different psychological disorders, from depression, anxiety, substance use, eating disorders, and often a target of treatment as well. So just to give a really brief outline of what kind of the process of emotion regulation looks like, it starts with a regulatory goal. So once people experience an emotion, they might decide, I'd like to modify this emotion in some way. They then select a strategy, which is how they'll modify the emotion. So it might be reframing it, it might be drinking alcohol, it might be talking to a friend, many different ways. They then implement that strategy, and then there's a process of ongoing monitoring and adjustments. So detecting, was that strategy effective in changing the emotion the way I wanted? So we know quite a bit about emotion regulation capacity, and what I mean by that is how effectively can people regulate their emotions under controlled, instructed circumstances. So this is often tested in the lab, where we might instruct people, show them a film clip that is intended to induce a particular mood, and then ask them to regulate their emotions in a particular way. But we can also think about emotion regulation tendency, which is how effectively do people regulate their emotions when they're just going about their daily life and doing this spontaneously, right? There's no one to tell them when or how to regulate, and the two can be quite different. In particular, for people with depression and anxiety, there's some evidence that they can regulate their emotions fairly well in the lab in that sort of instructed way, but that doesn't mean that they're able to enact that in their daily lives. So we really don't know nearly as much about emotion regulation tendency or how it relates to capacity. If you've been at the other talks today, you've heard a bit about experience sampling or ecological momentary assessment, so I won't go into detail. But the basic idea is that we assess people as they're going about their daily lives with brief surveys on a smartphone or perhaps sensors. And in doing so, we can be a little bit more confident that we're really capturing people's actual experience relative to kind of asking them to recall things over the past month, for example. And we can also capture changing contextual features, right? So the context that people are in at a given time very much impacts their emotional experience. And it can reduce things like recall biases. So one theory that's been put out there is that there are several different types of variables that might contribute to effective emotion regulation. So we can categorize these as person variables. So these are sort of characteristics of the person they bring that might facilitate emotion regulation or perhaps make it more challenging in certain ways. Situation variables refer to kind of the changing factors that are in play at that particular moment when people are trying to regulate emotions. And then there are many, many different strategies people can use. So which strategy people use, we know, has an important outcome. And in fact, what theory would suggest is it's not just each of these on their own that impacts them, but that they might interact in important ways. So it might be the case that for people with certain characteristics, when they're in a particular situation, a particular strategy might work best. So really we're talking about a three-way interaction here. So I'll just go into a little more detail about the sorts of variables that could go within these categories and that we looked at in this particular study. I won't define all of them just because there's a lot, but it includes at the person level demographic variables, things like age, gender, race, ethnicity. What's referred to as emotion regulation abilities. So these are sort of traits or characteristics that might facilitate emotion regulation. So for example, are people able to use a range of strategies? How aware are they of their emotions? Are they aware of their surroundings, contextual sensitivity? There are also some other relevant individual differences that would broadly potentially impact emotion regulation. So personality traits like neuroticism, executive functioning, and self-control. In terms of situation variables, the ones we're really focused on here are properties of the emotional sort of episode. So how intense is any negative emotion they're feeling, as well as positive emotion? Why are they trying to regulate their emotions? So is it because they just want to feel something differently? Or do they want to change their emotions to accomplish some other goal, for example, to facilitate a social interaction? And then do they feel that they have control over a particular what's happening in this situation, or is it something kind of out of their hands? And then there's a range of social and behavioral contexts that might be relevant. So socially, who are you with at that time? Are you by yourself versus with people you're quite close to or more distant others? What are you doing? Are you kind of actively engaged in something versus passively, watching TV or something like that? Are you doing a leisure activity versus a work or more obligatory activity? And then kind of broader context that we know is relevant to emotion regulation. Have you been engaging in physical activity recently or not? And what sleep was like the night before. So these are all shifting over time, even within the day. And then third, we have strategy variables, and there's more than we were able to look at, but we tried to capture a good range. So we can think of these as categorized by approach-oriented strategies. So this is things like accepting the emotion, trying to reappraise the situation that triggered it, seeking social support, reflecting on it, and savoring it. And with regard to more avoidance-oriented strategies, we have engaging in rumination or worry, trying to distract yourself, procrastination, venting, as well as a number of others. So what we try to do in this study is broaden kind of a very small research that has looked at some of these predictors either individually or maybe in small combinations to predict emotion regulation. So for example, past studies have shown that distraction tends to be more effective when people are experiencing very intense negative emotions, whereas reappraisal is more effective with lower intensity negative emotions. So that would be an example of an interaction. But we really don't know much about many of the variables that are out there that might be relevant. And no studies have examined a large number of these together, and certainly not like the three-way interactions that would be implied by that theory. And part of the reason is we don't have strong hypotheses to narrow down to a small enough set to test with frequentist statistical models. You'd need a giant sample size. That isn't feasible. And it really does require dynamic assessment in daily life as well, certainly to capture that situation or contextual piece. So in the current study, we use EMA as well as machine learning to test a broad array of different potential contributors and their interactions. So I'll talk today a little bit about the FEEL study, which has some similarities to some of what Lauren described. This is the feeling emotions in everyday life. And Lauren Bausma is a collaborator who's been involved in sort of all stages of this, but especially the psychophysiology. And also want to acknowledge and thank Rachel Hagman-Blair and Yasser Danya-Taleb, who have led and done all of the machine learning analyses. So this study was conducted in Australia. We had a total of 408 community adults enrolled and almost 375 who completed the EMA, so a pretty large sample. The sample's mostly female, mostly white. We didn't require any specific diagnoses to be included in the study, but we did try to get high rates of rumination and worry to kind of increase the likelihood that there would be some people who experienced more severe symptoms. And we had some exclusion criteria. A lot of it was around the psychophysiological assessment and ways these might complicate that. All right, so the overall design of the study was in 3 parts. The first part was a baseline lab assessment. So following screening, they come into the lab for about 4 hours. Then they do a 10-day experience sampling or EMA paradigm. And for that, they're answering a number of surveys each day and also wearing a sensor like the chest sensor that Lauren showed earlier throughout the day. And following that, they have just brief about 10-minute online surveys that they complete each month over the course of a year so that we can get a sense of longer-term outcomes and trajectories. So go into a little bit more detail on these. So the baseline lab assessment, we do semi-structured clinical interviews, especially focusing on depression and generalized anxiety. And then we kind of have a multi-method approach to look at a lot of the key variables in the study. So we have self-report, but also behavioral and physiological indices. I won't really focus on those today, so I won't go into detail. And we do have an emotion regulation task where we use kind of the standard laboratory assessment, and we're getting both their self-reported change in emotions while they're trying to regulate, as well as their heart rate variability throughout that. And an important piece of this, because the EMA protocol is a little bit complicated, is to really take some time to orient people to that, to walk them through what it's like, answer any questions they have. The next day, they start that EMA assessment. So this is, again, a 10-day protocol with surveys on the smartphone and continuous ECG assessment. There's also an accelerometer in the sensor, so we get that as well. And there's a couple types of surveys. One of them focus on emotional episodes in particular. So we want people to think about the strongest emotional episode they've had in the past 45 minutes or so. It might be positive, it might be negative, or both. And some of the reports are physiologically triggered, which Lauren went into a little detail about earlier. But basically when there's a drop in heart rate variability, detected in real time via the sensor relative to that person's baseline heart rate variability, that might indicate emotional arousal. And so that can then trigger a report. But they can also self-initiate a report if they kind of notice they were experiencing a strong emotion. We also had 4 randomly timed surveys that were a bit briefer and asked about current affect and symptoms. And the outcome variable that we're focusing on in the analyses I'll talk about today is emotion regulation effectiveness. So there's different ways you might define that. The way we did this here was we had first asked people, did you even want to change your emotions? And only for the reports where they said, yes, I did, we asked them to kind of say how they wanted to change it, increase or decrease positive or negative emotions. And then our key variable is based on 2 questions. How successful were you in changing your emotions in your desired manner? And to what extent did your response to your emotions help you achieve your goal? For example, to feel something different, to do something. And so both of these are rated on a 5-point scale. So as sort of the criterion for the analyses, we sum these 2 items, which are pretty highly correlated. And we did have quite good compliance. So it was approximately 84% of the reports were submitted validly. And about 90% of the time, people wore the sensor. Part 3 was that monthly follow-up. So each month they do a brief survey. And the key variables we are interested in there are their distress symptoms over the past month, their psychosocial functioning, so how well are they able to do what they need to at work, at home, socially, and well-being. And we also assess stressful life events and psychological treatment, because if those had sort of changed recently, that might impact these other variables. And from there, we can look at within-person trajectories across the 12 months of these 3 outcome variables. Okay, so a little bit about the data analysis. So this was a large and complex data set that required quite a bit of pre-processing. So for one thing, we had some variables measured at the person level, whereas others were, many different reports per person. So there's that nested structure. We also had a mix of nominal and ordinal variables as predictors. And what you can see here in the figure is the distribution of the outcome variable, emotion regulation effectiveness. So it ranged from 2 to 10. And you can see towards the right-hand side, very little representation of that upper end of the scale, right? So there are a few instances where people felt they had regulated their emotions very well. And so that's an issue when we're trying to predict this. And so one thing we did, there's a decent amount of missing data in a large data set like this, so used imputation, but also applied SMOTE, synthetic minority oversampling technique, which really helps to balance the variable so that it basically increases the minority class representation. Then once we had this processed data set, random forest models are run, and these are with 800 trees and 14 variables at each split. And we are particularly interested in measures of variable importance. So those were plotted by mean decreases in Gainey, and then also partial dependency plots, because for this particular question, simply knowing that something predicted emotion regulation effectiveness really wasn't enough, right? We really wanted to know the nature of that association. And so those plots allowed us to understand that. And then this is ongoing. So at this point, we have some of the two-way interactions that were visualized. I'll show you some examples there based upon the random forest results. We haven't yet gotten to the three-way interactions, so I won't be able to report those today, but they're underway. So overall, the model performance was quite strong. It explained 86% of the variance when all these predictors were there together in emotion regulation effectiveness. And the mean of squared residuals was 0.55. They also did a lot of looking at kind of the robustness of this across slightly different variations of the model. So looked at the models with or without imputation, with or without SMOT, and with or without a separate training sample that was withheld. And we got really similar results in terms of like the main variables that were coming across as most important. So that was quite encouraging. So we basically had kind of three groups based upon breaks in the variable importance plots that we're interpreting. And what you can see in these plots is the ones shown in red are the strategy variables, blue are the person level variables, and green are situation. So these are showing, again, the mean decrease in Gainey. So this is the first group of variables that were the most important in predicting effective emotion regulation. And so I won't go through all these in detail, but you can see a couple of the person level, in particular decentering, which is the ability to kind of step back from your experience and view it objectively, as well as self-control and how variable your strategy use is. Are you selecting particular strategies at certain times and different strategies at other times? As well as some of the sort of approach-oriented strategies. So tending to use acceptance, reflection, and savoring were all highly predictive. And then last, how pleasantly you felt the kind of triggering emotional event was. I have on two slides the medium importance variables that we would still kind of interpret and think about quite a bit. And these are largely person level variables. So just to highlight a few, we have things like how sensitive people were to the context, their physical activity, use of reappraisal and rumination. And then set shifting and working memory are both components of executive functioning. So these are kind of cognitive tasks that people did, as well as things like neuroticism, sleep, and age. Then we have a whole bunch of low importance variables. I won't go through all these, but what might jump up out at you from the colors that there's quite a few of the situation variables that are in this lower group, but still a mix. So kind of the next task was then to really look at all the partial dependence plots and understand, particularly for the more important variables, how do they actually relate to emotion regulation effectiveness. So you can see here at the bottom, that's sort of a, I don't know what you call it, but like a density plot to show the distribution of the data. So at the bottom we have the predictor, in this case it's decentering on the x-axis, and those lines showing the distribution of scores on decentering. Then on the y-axis, we have the predicted value of emotion regulation effectiveness. So what we can see here is generally a pretty strong positive linear trend, right? So as people are kind of better at decentering, at taking that objective perspective on their experiences, they tend to report that they're more able to effectively regulate their emotions. So what we would expect with theory. You do have it kind of level off at top. So I guess we have to think a little bit about whether to make something of that or not. Here's another example. So this is a situation variable that was moderately important predictor, sleep. And this one's a little bit more complex, I guess. So you can see it goes from 0 hours of sleep up to, what is that, 12.5? And so most of the data, as we might expect, is between about 5 hours and 10 hours, right? That's a more typical amount of sleep. And within that time period, we have this inverted U, right? And this is, I think, what we'd expect as well, that maybe around 8 hours for most people is kind of optimal in promoting good emotion regulation. But as you get less or much more than that, it might have some more negative effects on emotion regulation. But then at the end over here on the left, you can see kind of some strange things happening where people who got like less than 2 hours of sleep reported really good emotion regulation effectiveness, right? So this is something we're kind of thinking through. Is that meaningful given the sparsity of the scores in that range? What might that mean? Might it be people were a little, manic in sleeping so little and that impacted their ratings? So this is one we're thinking about. And then we have rumination and worry as a strategy variable example. And again, pretty much what we'd expect here. So we know that rumination and worry tends to lead to less effective emotion regulation. The outcome tends to be poor. And we can see a pretty clear negative linear association. So I'll just show a couple examples of interactions, but you can see, I think Rachel and Yasser did a really nice job like visualizing this because it's complex to interpret and put together. So this interaction is between self-control and decentering in predicting effective emotion regulation. And the warmer colors, like yellow, green, show that the variables associated with better emotion regulation, whereas the darker colors show poor emotional regulation. So in seeing these kind of separate quadrants, the way we can interpret this is that there's sort of a synergistic effect when people have both high levels of self-control and tend to decenter frequently, that there's kind of a boost, and that's particularly associated with good emotion regulation effectiveness. One more example, it's a little maybe less clear, but this is age by positive emotion differentiation. So looking in the bottom left-hand corner, we can see that on the x-axis is age, that younger people actually tend to be more effective when they have low positive emotion differentiation. We don't really see that effect coming through for older adults. So I thought I'd just highlight a few of the analytic challenges that have come up so far. Again, this is kind of ongoing, but one that I hadn't gotten into yet is how do we deal with really high resolution data? So in this case, we're not yet looking at things like heart rate and heart rate variability, though we'll get to that, but we are looking at sensor measured physical activity via the accelerometer. And so the way the data is 1 minute epochs of acceleration. We have this for 12 hours per day for 10 days for each person. So a massive amount of data. So how do we kind of map that on to the more time-limited reports of emotion regulation effectiveness? So the approach we took was testing 5-minute expanding windows up to 1 hour before a given report, when they reported on their emotion regulation effectiveness. And we ended up going with 45 minutes as kind of the optimal window for that. So that's what we used. But then we thought about, well, how do we want to quantify physical activity from this raw accelerometry data? And so from that data, we derived 4 metrics. So within that 45-minute window before the report, we took their mean accelerometry, the maximum, in case there might have been a shorter burst of physical activity we wanted to capture, and then 2 measures of variability, the coefficient of variation and the root mean squared successive difference. But rather than have kind of 4 correlated variables representing one thing in an already large model, we thought, let's see if we can reduce that so that we're still capturing those different elements, but in one variable. So with a principal component analysis, we looked at the first principal component and found that it captured most of the variance, I think maybe 65% or so. So that's what we ended up going with in the models, and I think works pretty well. But it still kind of brings up the question, well, how do we interpret what that is, right? When we're looking at the partial dependence plots, it's now sort of a conglomerate of all those metrics. So it's an interesting challenge to think through. And there's not really a lot of data on how best to do this, given that this kind of continuous physiological data is still relatively new. The visualizations are also challenging sometimes to interpret, but particularly, as I mentioned earlier, when there's really sparse data at certain points of the distribution, when do you sort of take something as meaningful and when do you take that as more noise where there is inadequate data? And so I think we're going to do some follow-up analyses in some cases to exclude some of the extreme values and see how that impacts the nature of the association. And then I think a tricky question, like really the conceptual question that motivated this was about the interactions, right? The 2- and 3-way interactions among these different types of variables. But with machine learning, you can generate all of the interactions, right? So you can have hundreds and hundreds of these interactions. But ultimately, we need a way of kind of sifting through those to figure out which ones might be worthy of follow-up research, which ones are robust and kind of meaningful, whether statistically or interpretively. And so this is something we're working with Rachel and Yasser on now to think about what might be a good objective way to identify a subset of these to kind of focus on and say, okay, this seems like something is there beyond the main effects. And our next step after that is to think about person-centered profiles from these variables that were particularly important or maybe had strong interactions in predicting emotion regulation effectiveness, and to look at those in reference to clinically relevant variables. So things like, did they have a diagnosis of depression or anxiety? Looking at their heart rate variability in the lab and in daily life. And also linking that up with those 12-month trajectories of symptoms, well-being, and functioning. And so I think there's some important applications of this. One is quite practical when it comes to interventions and therapy. I think we just really don't know how to advise with regard to like which strategies might be most effective when and for whom. We just don't have that knowledge. And I don't think there's going to be a really simple formula for it, but we might be able to create some kind of framework that could help to guide those decisions for people struggling with emotion regulation and for therapists. So certainly it would require replication, but our hope is to begin to provide some of that data that others can follow up on. And then this would have a nice application to just-in-time adaptive interventions where, based upon a person's current state, assessed using experience sampling or sensors, we could know when they might be in need of an intervention or suggestion, and we can send that via smartphones. And so this could provide some initial targets for that. So I want to acknowledge my lab at UWA, as well as my collaborators on this, and an IMH for the funding for this grant. Thank you. Sorry, can you say that again? Emotional regulation, as in depending on the situation, it may act out from an active to passive, like that, or I could be more accepting, or I could be in a state of denial, or I could portray that to a particular for that particular situational advantage or whatever is happening at that particular point. Based on that scenario. So what is the goal of emotional regulation in this particular context? Does it just mean being centered, as in not being controlled by the emotion, or does it mean? Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, so I think maybe one thing you're pointing out is that it's not the case that like one strategy always works in a particular way or right for a particular context. So sometimes it might be helpful to accept something. Sometimes it might be helpful to try to change it, for example. So yeah, I guess that's partly what this is trying to get at is like, rather than just thinking some of these are good or bad, really thinking more about matches between the person, how they try to regulate their emotion and the situation they're in. So yeah, so I think there are still these tendencies like overall, for the most part, for example, if you use decentering or reappraisal, you're likely to have more positive outcomes, but that doesn't mean it's uniformly the case, right? And so, so I think it's that more nuanced kind of fit and match between these different characteristics that we're trying to begin to get at a little bit. Does that answer? Well.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have two questions. So when you presented your results about the variables with respect to the emotional regulation, and did you find anything unexpected or something, before you do the results, right? And unexpected. That's one thing. Second thing, from those results, did you do any further analysis to see what contributed to that particular observation? Is it because the data is too noisy, or is it because of something more fundamental, which is different, some new discovery? Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think those are good questions. So I think especially for like just looking at a single variable in association with emotion regulation effectiveness, for most of those we would have a clear kind of idea of what that should look like. And so that was one thing we did, was kind of just a sense check, go through all of them and see, how many of these are kind of consistent with what we'd expect. Of course, we might have been wrong in what we expect, right? But if everything seemed different, that might indicate a problem. So most of them were really quite consistent with what prior literature and theory would suggest. I think there were a few, there were a couple that were in completely the opposite direction. Like behavioral avoidance was associated with better emotion regulation effectiveness, but that was a very low importance variable. So I don't think, that's one to put a lot of weight into. And then there were some that were just a really nonlinear association that was difficult to interpret, that we're kind of thinking about. The interactions is trickier because we don't always have theory about that. Or expectations, there's so little data out there. And so for that, this is really more kind of generative, and we think about, can we make sense of it? But it's hard to know what we would expect. So I think in the cases where we did see something unexpected, we are kind of looking more into, the distributions, making sure there's no, nothing weird in the data or outliers or things like that. But yeah, I guess it's a bit of kind of trying to figure out whether it's not what we expected because that's just what we found, versus is there something in the data that we need to work with more, that other ways to look at it.
Hi, so really nice talk. I was curious, why did you focus more so on predictive and also rather than inferential? So again, like, statistical relationship and things like that.
So by inferential, do you mean more like frequentist, like p-value type approaches? Is that what you're thinking of? Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's definitely the world that I know more. So that's how I tend to think about things. But in this case, because we really wanted to, this is quite exploratory, right? There wasn't really data to go on. And I guess the choice was either to limit it to 4 variables, and then we could have used a frequentist approach and looked at interactions. But that's very narrow. And so to have a broad array of these variables in a way that's really going to generate some new knowledge, I think we would have had hundreds of 3-way interactions, right? And so to correct for type 1 error, we would have needed a sample size of many thousands probably. And to do this kind of really intensive study, there's just no way. So I was really excited, to learn about what machine learning could do, that we could address this in an actually logistically feasible way with that method, in a more bottom-up generative way.
If you're able to find some interesting things, what would the next study look like?
Well, I feel like even though it's a lot of work, the study took 5 years to do. feel like replication is pretty important. So I would probably wanted to look at another data set and see, even if it's smaller, and see how well some of these things generalize, even on maybe a subset of, the main findings we had. But from there, I'm really interested in this idea of just-in-time adaptive intervention. So just to expand a bit, what we could do is kind of be assessing people using experience sampling to see when they're experiencing difficult emotions in real time, what's going on contextually. We might have like baseline information about their characteristics. And then using what we found, we might be able to make suggestions as to a strategy they might want to try, right? That the analyses had shown would be particularly effective for the situation they're in. So I think there's tricky things about how to do that in a way that people find helpful. It's possible when they're in the midst of something really difficult, that's not really what they want, But I think that would be really interesting to test and would have some potential to, if it's done in a way that is consistent with what people find useful, to really kind of bridge the gap between, just going to therapy once a week versus like really applying that in your daily life in the moments it's needed.